In April 2019, a seemingly insignificant event was recorded in the Haida Mountains, on the border of Toyama and Gifu prefectures. Human footprints were discovered on a closed route, despite the fact that there was no official record of tourists in the area. This route was considered abandoned for over 15 years. After a series of collapses, it was removed from maps and recommendations. It was not maintained or monitored, but no formal ban was imposed, so access remained technically possible. The forestry officer who first noticed the tracks would later report that they appeared fresh. The direction of movement was clear and confident, and did not resemble chaotic wandering or traces of old work. At that time, the information was recorded in the service log and was not followed up. Such discoveries in the mountains occur regularly and are rarely associated with serious incidents. A few days later, a man went missing in the same area. His name was Takao Miyajima. He was 30 years old and lived in the city of Takayama. He worked in a small printing house and did not attract attention in his everyday life. Miyajima had been a keen mountain hiker for many years, knew the Haida region well, had walked official routes many times, and followed standard safety rules, making him considered an experienced and cautious hiker. Several months before his disappearance, he began showing an interest in old maps of the region, particularly those that showed routes closed to the public. This interest seemed to be part of his hobby and did not arouse suspicion. Miyajima bought an old paper map at a sports equipment store. The salesman later recalled that the customer asked questions about abandoned trails and changes in terrain without specifying the purpose of the hike. The map was not a standard tourist publication. It contained handwritten notes, the origin of which could not be determined, but they did highlight several areas outside the existing routes. A week before the expedition, Miyajima appeared several times at the northern entrance to the massif. Surveillance cameras captured him near the information stand, where he spent a long time studying the diagrams and comparing them with the map he had brought. On the day of the expedition, he arrived at the official parking lot early in the morning. The weather conditions were stable, no precipitation was forecast, and the risk level was considered minimal even for a solo route. Before setting off, Miyajima sent his family a photo from the parking lot and a short message stating that he planned to return before evening and would not change his route. The first hours of the hike were worry-free. The navigation app tracked his progress along the official trail, and his speed and direction were consistent with his usual pace. After about 3 hours, his device's signal stopped updating, the last point being recorded between two peaks in an area considered safe and well visible. Communication failures like these are common in the mountains, so the signal loss was not initially considered a threat. It was expected that the connection would be restored on its own. However, by the evening, Miyajima had not made contact or returned to the car, after which his relatives filed a missing person report with the Toyama Prefectural Police. The very next morning, a search team was formed, including volunteer rescuers and dog handlers. Initially, it was assumed that the search would take a limited time. The main focus was on the area of the last signal. The terrain there was not difficult and did not indicate the possibility of a serious accident. During the initial inspection, no signs of a fall or accident were found, and weather conditions over the past 24 hours could not have significantly changed the situation. Only a few hours later, one of the search participants noticed tracks leading away from the official trail. The direction did not match the route and led into an area that was not included in the original plan of the operation. These tracks appeared relatively fresh. The depth of the impressions and the clarity of the edges indicated that they had been left shortly before the search began, and the direction of travel did not coincide with the official route. The area where the tracks led was not formally considered off-limits, but it was absent from modern maps. Most tourists avoided it due to unstable ground and a lack of visual landmarks. Based on the nature of the steps, it could be concluded that the person was moving confidently and without haste. The tracks did not indicate panic or an attempt to turn back, which immediately raised doubts among some of the search group. The dog handlers confirmed that the scent matched Takao Miyajima, and the dogs confidently took the direction and led the group deeper into an area that was not included in the original operation plan. About 100 meters later, additional prints became visible next to the main ones. They differed in size and shape of the sole, indicating the presence of a second person. At first, it was assumed that these could be old tracks preserved due to the characteristics of the soil, but visually, they looked no less fresh than Miyajima's tracks. The directions of movement periodically converged and diverged, creating the impression that two people were walking parallel or occasionally found themselves next to each other. Neither the police nor the emergency services had any information about other tourists in the area on the same day, and a check of logs and notifications revealed no matches. Surveillance cameras in the parking lot and access roads did not record any unauthorized vehicles. All entrances and exits corresponded to registered visitors. This meant that if the second person was indeed present, he either entered the area much earlier or used unofficial access. As the search progressed, the scent began to weaken, and the dogs lost direction several times and returned to their starting point, which usually indicates complex air currents or intersecting routes. A piece of equipment was found in one of the locations. It turned out to be a strap from Miyajima's backpack with characteristic abrasions. No signs of damage from animals were recorded. The remaining elements of the backpack were not found. The location of the discovery did not look like a fall or accident site, and there were no signs of sudden movement. This selective find did not correspond to the typical picture of an accident in the mountains, where more objects or traces of struggle with the terrain are usually left behind. In parallel with the fieldwork, police checked Miyajima's recent contacts. His phone calls and messages did not indicate any conflicts or alarming signals. The only deviation was a short exchange of messages with an unknown number a few days before the trip. Some of the content was lost, but the text mentioned the route and a specific date. It was not possible to identify the owner of the number. It was registered to a prepaid plan and was used for a limited time. After Miyajima's disappearance, the activity ceased. At this stage, this detail was recorded in the case materials, but was not developed separately due to the lack of direct evidence of a connection with the disappearance. As the search area expanded, it became apparent that Miyajima was not attempting to return to the official trail. The logic of his movements indicated a deliberate move deeper into the closed area. This was contrary to the standard behavior pattern even of experienced tourists. Usually in such situations, people tend to return to a familiar route or stop and wait for help. 2 days after the search began, forestry department employees who had worked in the area before the old routes were closed were brought in to help. They confirmed that the area where the tracks led had previously been used as an auxiliary trail. According to them, this route connected 2 valleys and was used by local residents and technical services. After the collapses, it was deemed unsafe and gradually removed from open access. When comparing the archival maps with the current coordinates, it turned out that the direction of Miyajima's movement almost completely coincided with the line of the old stitch. The difference was no more than a few tens of meters. This meant that he either had precise information about the existence of the route or was moving according to a pre-prepared plan. It no longer looked like a random deviation. The case file included a note indicating that Miyajima had previously been interested in maps from the 1990s, where this route was still marked. This detail took on new significance. Additional attention was drawn to the handwritten notes on the map he had acquired. One of them was located precisely in the area of the supposed exit to the old path. Experts were unable to determine the date of these markings, but the style did not match Miyajima's handwriting, indicating that the map had already been altered before purchase. This raised questions about the previous owner of the card and the purpose for which such marks might have been made, but the origin could not be established. As the search progressed, the group reached an area with more complex terrain, where the tracks became fragmentary and, in some places, disappeared completely. Despite this, the general direction was maintained. The movement continued along a line that coincided with the archival route, which confirmed the purposefulness of the path. In one of these places, The dog handlers completely lost the scent. The dogs returned to the previous point and could not choose a stable direction. This situation usually occurs when there is a sudden change in surface or when several routes intersect, but no visual reason for this has been found. Within a radius of several hundred meters, no traces of a camp or long stop were found, indicating that Miyajima had not planned to rest or spend the night. The lack of evidence of any attempt to take cover or signal further complicated the reconstruction of events. Standard scenarios did not fit. At the same time, police archives found a mention of another incident that had occurred in the area several years earlier, when traffic along the closed route was also recorded. That incident did not result in a missing person and was classified as a violation of the hiking rules, but the coincidence of direction was noteworthy. Upon re-examination, it was discovered that the same section of old stitching had been used in both cases, although it was not officially included in the reports. The data did not allow for direct conclusions to be drawn, but indicated that the route continued to be used despite its closure. A logical question arose: who exactly knew about the existence of this route and how information about it was transmitted outside of official sources? At this stage, the investigation had finally moved away from the accidental version, but there was still no clear alternative explanation for what was happening. After comparing several instances of the use of the closed route, investigators began to consider the theory that this route was informally known among a limited circle of people. First of all, attention was paid to technical service employees who had worked in this area in the past and were able to preserve old plans and coordinates. A review of the archives revealed that in the 1990s, temporary communications facilities and measuring points were indeed located here, with access to them restricted to certain groups. Most of these objects were dismantled, but some documentation remained incomplete and was not updated in public registries. One former Forestry Department employee confirmed that some routes continued to be used unofficially for patrols and inspections even after their closure. These tours were not recorded in tourist journals and did not involve the presence of outsiders. Information about them was passed on orally. This could explain the appearance of the second set of footprints if there really was a person familiar with the area near Miyajima. It remained unclear how Miyajima gained access to such information. No direct connections to technical services were found on his part. A check of Miyajima's social circle revealed no acquaintances working in the relevant structures, but some of his contacts were incomplete. Some of the phone numbers on his list were kept without names and were used extremely rarely. Their owners could not be identified. Additional attention was drawn to his visits to the northern entrance area several days before the expedition. Their frequency seemed excessive for normal preparation. Cameras recorded him spending a long time studying the area and comparing data with a paper map, without actually going along the route. This behavior could indicate an attempt to accurately determine the entry point into the restricted area, rather than simply assessing the conditions of the hike. During a second inspection of the area, searchers discovered another piece of equipment, a case from a navigation device. The device was missing from the inside and there were no signs of damage, which ruled out accidental loss during a fall. The location of the find was on the line of an old stitch and did not coincide with the last recorded signal point. This meant that the navigation device could be switched off or confiscated after leaving the official route. This scenario was not considered as the main one, but it was recorded as a possible explanation for the lack of further signals. By this time, the search operation was in the phase of reduction. The active phase was coming to an end due to the lack of new leads. Despite this, the case materials continued to be supplemented with circumstantial details that did not fit into a simple version of the incident. As the active phase of the search began to wind down, some of the materials were transferred to the prefectural police's analytical department. It was there that they first noticed that Takao Miyajima's disappearance did not fit the typical scenario of mountain incidents. In such cases, a logical sequence of traces is almost always preserved, which was not observed here. Analysts noted that after leaving the official route, Miyajima's movements remained orderly and purposeful, and his path showed no signs of disorientation or panic, which contradicted the theory of sudden disorientation or physical exhaustion. Particular attention was paid to the fact that Miyajima made no attempt to send a distress signal. Despite the availability of a navigation device and stable conditions, he was able to contact emergency services, but no calls or messages were recorded. An internal report indicated that the last section of the route to be reconstructed led to an area where auxiliary technical facilities had previously been located. Their function was not described in detail in open sources, but they were present on archival diagrams. Some of these objects were part of the communications infrastructure and measuring equipment. After dismantling, access to them was not completely blocked. Information about their exact location was preserved only in official documents and oral testimony. In the Forestry Department's archives, investigators found references to the periodic recording of human presence in the area even after the route was closed. These recordings were not treated as incidents and were not reported to the police. One such report mentioned the discovery of footprints near an abandoned platform, which were then explained as the remains of old maintenance work and were not linked to any incidents or complaints. A comparison of the coordinates showed that the said platform was located practically on the continuation of Miyajima's line of movement. This fact was not proof, but it strengthened the version about his awareness of the hidden infrastructure of the area. Gradually, the case materials accumulated indirect coincidences that, individually, did not seem significant, but, taken together, indicated that the closed route continued to be used outside the framework of official control. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Miyajima might have obtained information from someone who had previously worked with this infrastructure. There was no direct evidence of this, but indirect evidence pointed to this possibility. In this context, the unknown number with which Miyajima exchanged messages a few days before the expedition took on special significance. The nature of the correspondence seemed businesslike and concise, reminiscent of the agreement on specific actions. Analysis of the timing of the messages showed that they coincided with Miyajima's visits to the northern entrance to the massif, which could indicate clarification of the entry point or verification of access conditions to the closed area. After Miyajima's disappearance, the number was no longer active, was not used for calls or messages, and did not appear online, which seemed unusual even for prepaid plans. This type of behavior is more common in cases where a number is used for short-term contact and then intentionally removed from circulation, but it was not possible to prove intent in this situation. At the same time, police received several reports from local residents who recalled seeing people in the area inquiring about old routes and abandoned sites. These sightings had not previously been officially recorded. In several cases, strangers with old-style paper maps were described asking questions about passages that had not been used for a long time and were not listed in tourist guides. None of this evidence led to a specific identity or a direct connection to Miyajima's disappearance, but general interest in the restricted areas seemed persistent. At this stage, the investigation was in a complex phase. There was no direct evidence of a crime, but the version of an accident was losing credibility with each new comparison of facts. The official status of the case remained the same, but within investigative units it was increasingly viewed as an unusual case, requiring additional analysis and a revision of the initial assumptions. It was during this period that the hypothesis was first voiced that Miyajima's disappearance might be connected not only to his personal choice of route, but also to the existence of hidden access zones that only a few knew about. After hypothesizing about hidden access zones, investigators reviewed the archives of related agencies, including materials from telecommunications and geodetic services, where maps that were not included in tourist or municipal databases were sometimes stored. A number of documents contained references to temporary maintenance corridors. These were used to access equipment in hard-to-reach places and were not marked on public maps. After the work was completed, such corridors were formally closed but physically remained passable. One of these corridors was located in close proximity to the line of Miyajima's movement. The coincidence of coordinates was not exact, but was within the possible error of old measurements and changes in relief. An audit revealed that information about the existence of this corridor had not been updated for more than 10 years. Most active employees were unaware of it, and only certain departments had access to the archives. This meant that someone not connected to the relevant structures could only learn about the route through private sources, oral transmissions, or old documents that were not subject to official destruction. With this in mind, the question of the second set of tracks discovered near the Miyajima route arose again. Their appearance took on new meaning if we assume the presence of someone familiar with such infrastructure. The nature of these tracks was distinguished by a more confident step on difficult sections. The depth of the prints was uniform, which indicated a good knowledge of the terrain and the absence of doubts when moving. According to one expert, such signs are more common in people who have already walked this route before or have a precise idea of its configuration. A random tourist usually moves differently. Despite this, no direct evidence of joint movement was found. The tracks did not intersect constantly and did not indicate visual contact between the people. The search team's reports noted that in some places, the tracks seemed to disappear at once, after which they reappeared further along the route. This could be due to soil characteristics or a change in surface. However, the synchronicity of these disappearances seemed unusual, especially considering that they were observed in both sets of tracks at approximately the same points. Analysts considered the possibility of reaching areas with artificial surfaces or rocky platforms where footprints are not preserved. Such zones were indeed present in the area of old objects. If this assumption is correct, then the movement could have continued without visible traces for significant sections of the route, which would have significantly complicated the reconstruction of events. An additional complication was created by the absence of any finds related to the second person. No items of equipment or fragments of clothing were discovered. This suggested that the second participant was either better prepared or was not subjected to the same conditions as Miyajima, but such conclusions were not sufficient for an official version. During follow-up interviews, one of the rescuers mentioned that on the day of the search, he heard colleagues discussing a strange metallic sound in the area of the old path. At the time, they did not pay any attention to it. The source of the sound was not identified, and there was no recording in official documents. Such noises in the mountains are often attributed to natural causes or weather factors. However, when compared with data on technical objects, it became clear that structures that could produce similar sounds when the temperature changed were previously used in this area. This detail did not provide direct answers, but it added another layer to an already complex picture of what was happening, where natural and artificial elements were intertwined. At this stage, the investigation was a collection of fragments that did not yet fit together into a single pattern, but the number of coincidences continued to grow. As the scattered data accumulated, the investigative team concluded that without reconstructing a complete picture of the use of the old routes, further analysis would be difficult. So a decision was made to systematize all archival information related to the closed zones of the Hida Massif over the past several decades. Working with the archives revealed that some documents had been lost during departmental reorganizations, and some charts existed only in paper form and had not been digitized, creating gaps that could not be filled using standard methods. One of the older reports mentioned a restricted area that was used for temporary storage of equipment. It was officially decommissioned, but there was no mark indicating its closure. The geographical position of this section partially coincided with the direction of Miyajima's movement after leaving the official route. The distance did not allow us to speak of an exact coincidence, but it was within the possible deviation radius. Investigators noted that such coincidences no longer appeared random. Their number exceeded the statistical norm for standard search cases in mountainous areas. However, none of the discovered objects provided a direct answer to the question of what exactly happened to Miyajima. They only pointed to the existence of a hidden layer of infrastructure. Additional difficulties arose because many witnesses to the events of the 90s had either left their jobs or moved away, and it was not always possible to establish contact with them. Those who agreed to talk often recalled details fragmentarily, confirming the existence of old passages but unable to accurately indicate their current state. Several testimonies repeated the idea that some routes were never completely closed, but simply ceased to be mentioned in official recommendations. This created a situation in which access was retained for a narrow circle of people possessing the necessary information, while control over such movements was virtually absent. Analyzing Miyajima's behavior, investigators noted that his preparation for the expedition was distinguished by extreme precision. He didn't simply plan the route, but also compared various data sources. His interest in old maps and repeated visits to the entrance to the massif were now seen as elements of a targeted search for a specific point. However, no direct indication of his final destination was found in his personal records or electronic devices, creating the impression of a deliberate lack of trace. Experts noted that this behavior is typical of people who do not want to record their route explicitly, especially if the information was obtained informally. The lack of records could have been due to both caution and the understanding that standard methods of recording the route would be useless. Against the backdrop of these conclusions, the version of a spontaneous decision finally lost its relevance. More and more facts pointed to a pre-planned move beyond the usual campaign. However, the reasons for this decision remained unclear. The case materials contained no information about financial interests or personal conflicts that could explain the risk. This reinforced the feeling that the purpose of the trip was outside the usual categories. It was not connected with recreation or sporting interest. The investigative team determined that further progress was only possible if the source of information about the closed routes was identified. Without this, the picture remained incomplete. At this stage, the case remained open, but internally it was already being viewed as a complex, multi-layered episode that went beyond the scope of normal search operations. After establishing the theory of deliberate departure from official routes, the investigative team focused on reconstructing the possible sequence of Miyajima's actions up to the moment of disappearance, paying particular attention to minor details that had previously been considered unimportant and not analyzed in the overall context. Surveillance footage from Takayama City in the days leading up to the expedition was re-examined, revealing Miyajima's movements outside his usual home workshop routes, some of which had no obvious explanation. In one of the episodes, he was recorded near the municipal archive building. He had no official reason for visiting this place, but old plans for the development and infrastructure of the mountainous regions were stored inside. It was not possible to confirm the fact of his entry into the archive, but his appearance near this building seemed atypical and coincided with his active interest in closed routes. His meeting with an elderly man captured on cameras near a gear store attracted additional attention. The quality of the recording did not allow for identification, but the length of the conversation indicated a meaningful exchange. According to the seller, this man had previously visited the store and inquired about maps of old neighborhoods, but did not make any purchases or leave contact information. Investigators suggested that it was through such informal contacts that information about forgotten routes could be transmitted. This method of disseminating data leaves no documentary traces. A review of local tourist and hunting communities revealed that discussions of closed zones sometimes occur in private circles without being publicly disclosed. Such discussions are most often attended by people with experience working or living in the region for a long time. For them, the old routes are not perceived as forbidden. Miyajima was not officially a member of such groups, but his interests and behavior indicated an attempt to gain access to restricted knowledge. An analysis of his purchases revealed that several weeks before the trip, he had purchased additional equipment that was not required for the standard route, but could be useful when moving through difficult terrain. At the same time, he did not inform his family or friends about the change in plan. Outwardly, his behavior remained calm and did not cause alarm. Investigators noted that such secrecy is typical of people who are reluctant to discuss the purpose of their actions in advance, especially if it involves unofficial activities. Despite all these observations, none of the facts allowed us to establish the exact moment or place where the key event that led to the disappearance occurred. The lack of a sharp break in the tracks or signs of violence left open a wide range of theories, each with its own weaknesses. Internal discussions increasingly revolved around the possibility that Miyajima might have reached a certain point and that events then developed outside the zone of recorded traces. Such a point could be located in the area of old technical facilities, access to which was not controlled or tracked by modern systems. If this is true, then further movement could have occurred on a surface that does not retain prints, which would explain the sudden disappearance of the trace pattern. However, without direct findings, this version remained a guess and could not be considered the main one. By this point, the case was a collection of carefully verified facts and assumptions, between which there remained significant gaps. After analyzing all available data, the investigative team concluded that the key events most likely occurred during a period not covered by either search operations or technical recording. This time gap became the central problem of the case and prevented the reconstruction of an unbroken chain of events. Attempts to narrow this interval were based on weather conditions and speed of movement. Calculations showed that Miyajima should have reached the supposed area of interest significantly before the possibility of tracking his path disappeared. This meant that either he stayed in the area of the old objects longer than expected, or his further movement took place under conditions that excluded the preservation of traces and signals. An additional factor was the peculiarity of the terrain in this part of the massif. The alternation of rocky areas and artificial surfaces made traditional search methods ineffective. Mountain search experts have noted that such areas often become blind spots, where a person can remain for extended periods of time without being seen or noticed. There were no signs that Miyajima was planning a long stay, and no supplies or equipment designed for autonomous operation were found on him. This imbalance between the intended route and the preparation reinforced the feeling that the expedition had a strictly defined goal and time frame. This was also supported by the fact that he did not leave any landmarks or notes that could have helped in the event of a delay. Such behavior is uncharacteristic even for experienced tourists. Investigators also noted that after Miyajima's disappearance, there were no reports of accidental discoveries or sightings in the area of the old path. This could indicate that further developments took place in a place where access for outsiders was extremely limited. Analysis of satellite images did not provide additional information. The image resolution did not allow for the identification of small objects or traces of activity in the complex terrain. The reports noted that even with the availability of modern technology, such areas remained difficult to monitor and control. Against this backdrop, the version that Miyajima was outside the standard monitoring zone began to be considered one of the most probable. However, the lack of supporting findings did not allow this version to be considered the main one. It remained a working hypothesis. The investigative team determined that further progress is only possible upon receipt of new information from outside or upon discovery of a previously unaccounted for object. All attempts at repeated inspections were unsuccessful. The area retained its original appearance and did not reveal any additional details. This created a feeling of a vicious circle, where each new assumption ran up against the same limitations. Internal case materials increasingly contained language indicating the unusual nature of the disappearance without directly indicating the cause. However, the case was not closed and continued to be considered subject to review if new information emerged. The situation remained uncertain, and a key section of the Miyajima route remained unexplained. Over time, the Miyajima case was relegated to the category of investigations without an active phase, but within the departments it continued to be viewed as potentially significant, due to the unusual number of inconsistencies that could not be explained by standard causes for mining accidents. The analytical reports specifically noted that the disappearance occurred in an area where no formal activity was recorded, although indirect evidence indicated regular use of this area outside of tourist routes. One of these signs was the condition of the soil in certain sections of the old path. According to experts, it was subject to compaction characteristic of periodic human passage, rather than a single event. These observations could not be quantitatively confirmed, but they were consistent with the testimony of former employees who spoke of unofficial bypasses and accesses that remained even after the route was closed. Of additional interest was the absence of any warning signs or physical barriers in the area of the supposed exit to the hidden objects, despite their potential danger. This state of affairs was explained by the fact that the objects were considered decommissioned and were of no interest to the general public, and control over them was minimal. The case materials also mentioned that similar situations had been recorded in other regions of the country, where closed routes continued to be used by a limited number of people without official registration. These cases did not result in disappearances and therefore did not receive widespread publicity, but they created a context in which Miyajima's behavior ceased to appear entirely unique. However, in his case, the combination of factors remained exceptional. An experienced hiker, the lack of a distress signal, a second set of tracks, and the loss of equipment did not fit together into the usual picture. Investigators noted that this combination is more common in situations where a person interacts with a predetermined point or object rather than acting impulsively. In this context, the version was considered that Miyajima could count on a meeting or contact in a certain place, which reduced his subjective sense of risk. However, no evidence of such a meeting was found. All possible witnesses were either absent or could not be identified. The absence of signs of a struggle or a sudden change in route indicated that events unfolded without external pressure, at least at the initial stage. This reinforced the assumption that the key moment occurred after leaving the recorded zone, where conventional observation methods ceased to work. Internal comments on the case emphasized that further progress in the investigation was impossible without a change in approach. Standard procedures had been exhausted. The possibility of engaging specialists in abandoned infrastructure and historical sites was considered, but there was no formal basis for this. The case remained open in an administrative sense, but was effectively in a state of waiting for new information. Any new reports of strange activity in the Hida area were automatically cross-referenced with the Miyajima disappearance case. Despite this, none of the subsequent checks yielded results that could be directly linked to his route. Thus, by this point, the story was an unfinished sequence of events in which the key link had never been discovered. Sometime after the active investigation ended, the case materials were transferred to the archives. However, within the police, it continued to be considered an example of a complex disappearance with atypical characteristics. It was periodically returned to during the training of new officers and the analysis of unusual situations. Analytical commentaries emphasized that the key problem was the lack of a breaking point. In most cases, it is possible to establish the moment at which events become irreversible. In the case of Miyajima, such a moment could not be identified. The sequence of his actions before entering the closed route seemed logical and consistent, and then suddenly disappeared, as if the further path passed outside the usual observation space. Some experts have noted that a similar effect occurs when a person moves from a publicly accessible area to an environment intended for limited use, where standard control mechanisms do not apply. In the Hida Mountains, such zones formerly existed, but their exact boundaries were erased over time. They were not marked on maps and were not designated in reality. This created a paradoxical situation in which a person could be within a known array, but at the same time be completely outside the accounting and observation system. One internal review noted that Miyajima's disappearance did not show signs of an emergency, making it less likely to be a sudden accident. The lack of any sudden changes in behavior before the hike also indicated that he did not expect danger and did not perceive his route as critically risky. This could mean that he was counting on predetermined conditions or assistance that, for some reason, was not realized. However, no documents or evidence confirmed the existence of such an agreement. Everything remained at the level of speculation. In subsequent years, the Hida region continued to be used for tourist routes, with official routes being renovated and maintained, while the older passages were neglected. From time to time, the Forest Administration recorded traces of presence in closed zones, but these did not lead to new investigations and were considered unauthorized passages. Each such message indirectly confirmed that the closed routes had not disappeared completely, but continued to exist outside of formal control. In the context of the Miyajima case, this meant that his route was not unique, but his disappearance was notable for its lack of any consequences or explanation. Investigators noted that if events had developed differently, even a minimal discovery could have changed the course of the case, but no such discoveries were made. Over time, the case did not gain new insights, but it continued to remain in the memory of those involved in the investigation as an example of a situation with no obvious outcome. It was a reminder of the limits of search capabilities even in well-studied areas and with experience in technology. Internal reports emphasized that a combination of human factors and hidden infrastructure could create conditions in which disappearances remain unexplained. In the absence of new data, official formulations remained cautious and did not go beyond speculation. Takao Miyajima's story never reached its conclusion, remaining an example of how even familiar terrain can conceal unknown levels. Over time, the Miyajima case began to be used as a case study in analyzing disappearances in mountainous areas, with experts noting that even with experience and training, a person can disappear without leaving a trace if they end up in a restricted area. The training reviews emphasize that closed routes present a particular challenge. They do not formally exist for the monitoring system, but they remain physically accessible for travel. In the case of the Haida Massif, there were more such areas than expected, some of which had no clear boundaries and were not marked on either tourist or official maps. This created conditions under which a person could move between the areas of responsibility of different services while remaining outside the attention of each of them. Analyzing Miyajima's route, experts noted that his route passed through border areas where control was minimal or completely absent. A number of internal documents expressed the opinion that such zones require a separate approach and a revision of accounting methods, but no practical changes were made. The situation was complicated by the fact that these territories were not formally considered dangerous, so resources were not allocated for monitoring them. As a result, any incidents in such places turned out to be difficult to reconstruct and analyze. In the context of the Miyajima case, this meant that even with repeated inspections, key elements could be missed due to a lack of systematic oversight. Some experts have indicated that the disappearance may not have occurred suddenly, but rather as a result of a sequence of events spread out over time. This scenario suggested that Miyajima could have been in the old object zone longer than previously thought, remaining outside the search area. The absence of signals and traces was explained by the characteristics of the surface and infrastructure not intended for recording movement. However, none of the discovered factors made it possible to determine the exact moment when the situation became irreversible. This distinguished this case from most mining incidents, where the critical point is usually clearly identified. The materials also noted that the absence of witnesses does not necessarily mean the absence of other people. In closed areas, intersections may go unnoticed. This conclusion was indirectly confirmed by the presence of a second set of traces recorded at the beginning of the search. Despite this, the identity of the second person could not be established, and no report or investigation led to any concrete results. All possible versions remained hypothetical and did not go beyond the scope of analytical discussions. Over time, the case lost its operational relevance but retained analytical value as an example of a complex disappearance. Miyajima's story continued to remind us that even in structured and studied regions, there are spaces that remain outside of complete control. As the case remained stagnant, the researchers' attention increasingly shifted from Miyajima's personality to the very environment in which the disappearance occurred, with the Hida Massif being viewed not as a backdrop, but as an active factor influencing the course of events. Topographical analysis revealed that in the area of the old routes, there is a complex network of crossings that developed over decades and were not always reflected in official maps. These crossings arose as a result of economic activity and technical work. Over time, they lost their purpose, but physically continued to exist. Without labeling and control, such areas became invisible to most accounting systems, but could still be used by people with the relevant knowledge. The case materials emphasized that Miyajima did not appear to be a person who had accidentally ended up in such a zone. His preparation and behavior indicated a deliberate choice of direction. However, there were no signs that he was planning a long stay or independently resolving possible problems along the route. This imbalance between awareness and minimal insurance continued to be one of the key mysteries of the case. Experts noted that such behavior is possible in a situation where a person relies on external conditions that he considers reliable. In this case, such conditions could be familiarity with the object or confidence in the possibility of a quick return. However, none of the verified versions provided confirmation of the existence of such a resource or contact. Over time, the case materials began to be used in discussions of the risks associated with abandoned infrastructure in natural areas. Internal recommendations indicated the need to consider unofficial routes when planning search operations. However, in actual practice, such changes were implemented slowly and were not systemic. This meant that similar situations could recur without significant changes in approaches to control and monitoring. In the context of Miyajima's disappearance, this gave the case added weight as a warning about hidden vulnerabilities. The investigative team noted that even minimal new information could have led to a review of the case, but no such information emerged. All possible sources of information were checked. Archives were studied, witnesses were interviewed to the extent possible. Despite this, the central question of Miyajima's fate remained unanswered. The lack of a final point turned this story into an example of an unfinished investigation, where the logic of events ends without explanation. It was precisely this incompleteness that continued to hold the attention of specialists and made the Miyajima case the subject of analysis years later. Subsequent analyses have concluded that Miyajima's disappearance cannot be considered in isolation from the region's unique characteristics. The Haida Mountains represent a complex environment where official infrastructure coexists with the remains of old technical and economic facilities. These remains are not always visible on the surface and are often not marked on modern maps, but they can form alternative travel routes that are not taken into account in standard search planning. The case materials emphasize that such methods are not secret in the literal sense. Information about them is preserved fragmentarily and transmitted to a limited circle of people through personal experience. It was precisely this factor that made it difficult to establish the source of Miyajima's knowledge. He could have obtained information not through documents, but through oral contact, which cannot be restored retroactively. The investigative team also noted that the absence of digital traces does not necessarily indicate an attempt to conceal the information. In areas with unstable communications and difficult terrain, recordings may cease naturally. However, in combination with other features, this fact reinforced the feeling of going beyond the usual tourist space. An analysis of Miyajima's behavior before the expedition revealed no signs of pressure or coercion. His actions appeared voluntary and consistent. This excluded versions related to a sudden threat or conflict at the moment of departure on the route. At the same time, the complete absence of traces of his further presence remained unexplained. Even in the most unfavorable scenarios, indirect markers usually remain. The absence of such markers indicated that the key stage of events occurred in an area not covered by observation and search methods. Internal discussions increasingly focused on the concept of blind spots, areas that are formally within the surveyed areas, but in fact remain outside control. In the Haida Massif, there were more such zones than initially expected, which called into question the completeness of existing maps and regulations. The Miyajima case has become one of the arguments in favor of revising approaches to risk assessment in such areas. However, on a practical level, Changes were slow and did not affect completed investigations. This meant that Miyajima's specific fate remained outside the scope of possible conclusions and recommendations. Official formulations continued to use cautious expressions that did not allow for categorical statements. This position reflected the real state of affairs. The lack of evidence did not allow for any clear conclusions to be drawn. At the same time, the combination of circumstances itself continued to be considered extremely rare and indicative. The case materials were periodically raised during discussions of unusual disappearances, but were not developed further. The story of Takao Miyajima remained an open question in which the location and sequence of events are only partially known. In subsequent internal discussions, experts repeatedly returned to the question of why the Miyajima case felt unfinished business, a key feature being that the disappearance occurred without a sharp turn of events or a discernible moment of loss of control. In most mountain accidents, there is a point after which the development of events becomes obvious: a fall, an injury, or a sudden change of route. In this case, no such point could be identified despite a detailed analysis of all available data. The absence of this boundary created the impression that events developed smoothly and consistently until they went beyond the observed space, after which the recording simply ceased. Experts noted that this pattern is more common in cases where a person moves from an open-access environment to a functionally different area not intended for public presence. In the Hida Massif, such zones were formed historically and preserved fragmentarily. They were not secret, but they were not included in the field of attention of most services. From an analyst's perspective, Miyajima may have perceived such an area as part of the route rather than a source of danger, which would explain the lack of alarm on his part. However, the impossibility of confirming its further movement made any reconstruction conditional and incomplete. Official documents emphasized that even if the hypotheses were completely consistent, it was impossible to compensate for the lack of actual findings. This limited the investigation's capabilities and prevented the formation of a final version of events. Over time, the Miyajima case came to be seen as an example of a situation where the environment plays no less a role than the human factor. Analytical conclusions shifted from the question of what happened to the question of where exactly it might have happened. This shift reflected the understanding that the key to the mystery might lie not in human actions, but in the characteristics of space. However, without access to new data or changes in search terms, these assumptions remained theoretical. The case continued to exist as an open question with no possibility of practical continuation. Internal reports noted that if similar incidents were to recur, more attention should be paid to unofficial routes and historical infrastructure. These recommendations were general in nature and were not directly related to Miyajima's fate. He himself remained a figure without a final episode, a man whose actions were known only up to a certain point. Everything that happened after this moment remained outside the scope of documented reality. It was precisely this lack of an ending that made the story particularly persistent in the memories of those involved in the investigation. The disappearance of Takao Miyajima remains an example of how familiar surroundings can conceal events that are impossible to fully reconstruct.